The shocking story begins with a strange phenomenon in space. A peculiar explosion occurred near Earth's orbit, and its rays were directly hitting the surface of Earth. Scientists were busy recording this incident and collecting data about it, but the rays only hit the Earth's surface for a few seconds before disappearing. Due to the lack of visible destruction, scientists believed that no harm had been done by the rays. However, they were unaware that these dangerous rays had affected the ant species residing underground. The rays caused all the ants to behave in a completely unusual manner. Ant species from around the world began to gather together, even including those that were normally enemies. It seemed that the rays had significantly enhanced the ants' IQ levels, and now they had started to think for themselves. All the ants, like humans, gather together for meetings, as if they are planning an attack on someone. At this point, we are introduced to Dr. Hubbs, a scientist, who is the first to notice these ants. Dr. Hubbs realized that there were changes in the behavior of these ants, so he began his research on them. Dr. Hubbs could not understand how ants of different species could come together, and he was soon shocked to discover that many spiders had suddenly disappeared from one location. Dr. Hubbs suspected that these advanced ants might have eaten the spiders, as the ant population was continuously increasing and had become much more dangerous than before. Dr. Hubbs provided all the information he had gathered about the ants directly to the government for further consideration. Although the government did not take Hubbs' experiment very seriously, due to repeated requests, they assigned him an assistant. They would need to go to a village to research the ants and provide reports to Dr. Hubbs as soon as possible. Dr. Hubbs agrees to the experiment and meets his assistant, Lesko, who is also a scientist and will assist Hubbs throughout the experiment. Both scientists set off towards the village, where a large population of ants had been observed. As soon as Hubbs and Lesko arrive in the village, they find all the houses in ruins, as if there had been a coordinated attack. After going a little further, they see large structures made of mud. These structures were created by the ants themselves. Dr. Hubbs cannot understand how the ants are creating such perfectly shaped structures and realizes there must be something more going on that needs to be investigated immediately. While Dr. Hubbs and Lesko are examining the structures, they notice small ants inside the structures observing them, as if they have developed the ability to think. The two scientists begin a thorough investigation of the entire village, searching for ant samples. Hubbs notices that several animals have suddenly died, and upon closer inspection, he sees small marks on the animals' bodies. He concludes that it must be the work of the ants, which are entering the bodies and consuming all the flesh. A very large group of ants had caused significant damage, so Dr. Hubbs and Lesko took refuge in a house where an elderly man lived with his family. Dr. Hubbs advised the old man to leave due to the dangerous situation, but the elderly man did not know where to go with his wife and daughter, as all his property was there. Despite Hubbs' warnings, the man refused to leave and even responded angrily to Hubbs. Feeling helpless, Hubbs and Lesko were forced to leave the house and set up their camp inside the village, where there was also a large laboratory. They set up all their equipment in the lab and tried to find a way to communicate with the ants. Dr. Hubbs received several calls from government officials asking if any results had been obtained. Hubbs clearly stated that it might take some time for proper results, requesting more time for a thorough investigation. Lesko was also making every effort to communicate with the ants, but there was no response from their side. Frustrated, Dr. Hubbs decided to use grenades to blast the large structure created by the ants, believing that destroying it might force the ants to come out. And indeed, this approach seemed to work. But this explosion made the ants much more aggressive. At night, the ants first went to the elderly man's house, where they began killing all the animals kept in his stable. Now, they started destroying the house as well, setting it on fire. The elderly man, seeing his house burning, hurriedly placed his wife and daughter in the car and tried to escape. Meanwhile, Lesko informed Hubbs that he had received some strange signals coming from the ground. Hubbs suspected these signals were from the ants, but they needed to be decoded first. Lesko mentioned that there were several patterns similar to each other, so if he applied different types of algorithms, they might be able to understand the ants' language. Lesko then focused on decoding these languages. Inside the car, the elderly man's wife noticed a small ant on her head. As soon as they removed the ant, a multitude of ants began to emerge from inside the car, as if they had been waiting to come out. The elderly man quickly fled with his family towards the laboratory. At the lab, Lesko had worked diligently and had almost decoded the signals sent by the ants. But suddenly, there was a huge explosion outside the car, making the ants around the laboratory much more active. They banded together and completely destroyed the generator, causing a power outage in the lab. Dr. Hubbs noticed through the camera that this must be the work of the ant group. Therefore, he quickly pressed a button that spread a liquid around the laboratory, which was meant to kill the ants. Dr. Hubbs began to disperse the liquid around the lab, but he was unaware that the elderly man and his family were also approaching the lab door. As a result, the dangerous liquid also affected their bodies. When Hubbs and Lesko emerged from the lab in the morning, wearing suits, Lesko was shocked to see that the elderly man and his wife had both died. However, Dr. Hubbs did not pay much attention to their dead bodies and went on to investigate the changes in the ants' bodies. When Lesko reached the dead body of the elderly man, he noticed 3 holes in it, similar to the ones found in the bodies of the animals. These holes were where the ants had entered and consumed the internal organs. Ants were emerging from these holes, confirming that the ants had indeed killed the elderly man and his wife. Dr. Hubbs had collected all the samples, but suddenly the elderly man's daughter, Lisa, emerged from a chamber where she had hidden during the ant attack. To protect her, Dr. Hubbs and Lesko brought Lisa into the laboratory. After gathering numerous ant samples and conducting experiments, Lesko and Hubbs discovered that all the ant species had a very common cell, and this new cell had made them highly advanced. Surprisingly, ants that used to be extremely afraid of large predators had now united to kill them all. This kind of aggressive behavior was unprecedented for Dr. Hubbs. Lesko suggested to Dr. Hubbs that they should focus on Lisa, as she had no experience staying in such a situation. He proposed requesting the government to send a helicopter to safely evacuate Lisa from the laboratory. However, Dr. Hubbs was reluctant to do so, fearing that if the government found out that people had died during their experiment, they might react severely and possibly shut down the entire project. Dr. Hubbs did not want to take any risks. When Lesko called the government to request a helicopter, Lisa entered the laboratory and began observing the ants very closely. Lisa had a clear idea that these dangerous ants had killed her family members, so she went completely out of control and started killing the ants lying around. Many of Dr. Hubbs' equipment had been damaged, so Lesko and Hubbs tried to manage the situation and move Lisa to another compartment. Unfortunately, while dealing with all this, Dr. Hubbs got bitten by one of the ants, but he did not share this with anyone. The scene then shifts to show that one of the ants, after being fed the yellow liquid that was used to kill ants, brought it to its queen. After consuming the liquid, the queen laid an unusual egg, which produced a highly upgraded ant that was immune to the liquid. This indicated that the ants were evolving over time. The ants had now constructed even more bizarre structures outside the laboratory, reflecting sunlight directly onto them. Due to the intense rays falling on the laboratory, the temperature inside had risen significantly. Dr. Hubbs was shocked to learn that the ants had become so intelligent that they were using external factors to try to kill them. Lesko began blaming Dr. Hubbs, insisting that they had to inform the government immediately so that help could be sent. However, Hubs continued to refuse, saying it was not an option. When Lesko tried to turn on the communication system, it had short-circuited. Lesko opened the communication machine and found that ants had formed a cluster and entered the circuit, causing the machine to fail completely. The ants inside the laboratory began cutting the wires, which led to many electronic devices shutting down. They had even trapped a mantis in an air conditioning unit, deliberately causing a major short circuit, which resulted in the air conditioner breaking down. The ants seemed to know that by increasing the external heat and damaging the air conditioner, the internal temperature of the laboratory would rise rapidly. Lesko was astounded by the intelligence of these ants. Now completely trapped, Lesko decided to use all his decoding algorithms to try to communicate with the ants. He used mathematics, a universal language, to decode the signals and convert them into understandable messages. Meanwhile, outside, the highly intelligent ants were gathering the dead ants who had lost their lives in the large structure, as if holding a funeral for them. This kind of behavior was being observed for the first time. Inside the laboratory, Dr. Hub's condition was deteriorating rapidly. An ant had bitten his hand, which was now swelling up severely. Lisa, witnessing these events, approached Dr. Hubs. He then noticed the advanced ant that had recently been created by the queen. This ant was the most advanced one yet and could not be killed by poison. Dr. Hubs rushed to eliminate this ant, but Lesko intervened to help him. Hubs was completely out of control, causing destruction all around him. After conditions returned to normal, Dr. Hubs informed Lesko that there is a queen ant outside. If they manage to kill the queen, the entire group of ants will lose their command from the queen, causing them to scatter. The next day, when Lesko checked his communication device, he discovered that the ants had replied to the message. The reply was a circle with a smaller circle inside it, similar to their previous message. Lesko could not understand the meaning of this signal. After much thought, he realized that the large circle represented the laboratory, and the smaller circle inside might represent a person inside the laboratory, which was Lisa. Lisa was also looking at Lesko's decoding message and understood that the ants were likely targeting her. Initially, the ants wanted to attack her, but she had survived. If Lisa did not leave, the ants would kill both Lesko and Dr. Hubs. Once Lisa understood this clearly, she decided to leave the laboratory to save both of them. The ants were continuously attaching themselves to Lisa's body. Meanwhile, Dr. Hubs had discovered the location of the queen ant. After being bitten by ants, his body was completely infected and had become very weak. Determined, Dr. Hubs equipped himself with grenades and guns and began to advance towards the queen. Despite Lesko's attempts to stop him, Dr. Hubs was resolute. He pushed Lesko away and went directly to the ground, but shortly after, he suddenly fell into a pit. This pit was a trap set by the ant colony to kill him. Once trapped, the ants gathered together and began consuming Dr. Hub's body, leading to his immediate death. Lesko was extremely angry about this. He put on his protective suit and started releasing poisonous gases everywhere. Lesko knew that if he did not destroy these ants quickly, they would rapidly increase in number and spread across the world. Therefore, he continued to spread poisonous gases without regard for his own safety. However, he had not yet found the queen ant. Suddenly, Lesko spotted a large pit and heard someone screaming from inside. He jumped directly into the pit. Lesko suddenly sees Lisa emerging from the ground, completely unharmed, meaning the ants hadn't killed her. Lisa then gets very close to Lesko and takes him out. Lesko thought everything was okay, but the reality was that the ants had orchestrated all of this. They had manipulated Lesko's mind by trapping him with Lisa to keep their queen safe and to expand their population as quickly as possible. Lesko, who was an eyewitness to all this, also ends up going away with Lisa. This means that the ants will soon grow their population and take over the entire Earth. And with this dangerous ending, our story concludes here.